Graceful Redemption Church was alive with energy that morning. The choir's voices soared in perfect harmony, the congregation clapped along, and a sense of joy filled the air. It was the kind of Sunday that reminded everyone why they came to worship. At the center of it all stood Pastor Philip Jackson, his powerful voice leading the way, his presence commanding every eye in the room. To his congregation, he was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of faith, of hope, and of what a man of God should be. Beside him sat his wife, Ellen, her serene smile glowing with pride, their 3 children sitting neatly in a row. They were the picture-perfect family, a beacon of unity in a community that adored them. But they say perfection is an illusion. And that morning, as the church swayed to the rhythm of hymns and prayers, no one could have imagined the storm brewing beneath the surface. Secrets that would unravel lives, betrayals that would shake the very foundation of trust, and choices that would leave an entire community questioning everything they believed in. What would you do if the life you built, the family you loved, the trust you earned, was nothing more than a beautiful lie? A lie so dangerous it could destroy everything? Well, that's the story we're diving into today. But before we get into the twists and turns, let me introduce myself. I'm Vic, your storyteller of secrets, scandal, and a bit of suspense. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now before someone tells your secrets instead of me. And hey, share this video with someone who loves a good true crime story. Maybe that one friend who's always saying, "I don't gossip." Yeah, sure they don't. It all started with a simple visit to the doctor. A routine checkup for a child. Something so ordinary. Until it wasn't. Graceful Redemption Church stood as a beacon of hope, its stained glass windows catching the morning sun and scattering a kaleidoscope of colors onto the bustling congregation below. Every Sunday, the pews were packed with families eager to find inspiration, guidance, and a sense of belonging. The air was thick with anticipation, a blend of whispered conversations, rustling hymnals, and the faint scent of lilies decorating the altar. At the center of it all stood Pastor Philip Jackson. Tall, with a commanding presence and a baritone voice that could both soothe and stir the soul, Philip was more than just a pastor. He was a symbol. To the hundreds who gathered here each week, he was the epitome of righteousness, a man whose faith was unshakable and whose family was the shining example of Christian unity. His sermons carried a weight that lingered long after the final hymn, leaving those in attendance with a renewed sense of purpose. On this particular morning, Ellen Jackson, his wife of 13 years, sat in the front pew, her posture immaculate, her smile serene. Ellen was adored for her quiet grace, her unwavering support of her husband, and the warmth she brought to everyone she encountered. She had a way of making others feel seen, valued, and uplifted, a skill that complemented her husband's public role perfectly. Beside her sat their children, completing the picture of a flawless family. Joshua, the eldest at 12, already had his father's confident demeanor, his back straight as he followed along in the Bible with careful concentration. 9-year-old Naomi was the vibrant heart of the family, her playful energy bubbling just beneath the surface as she hummed along with the hymns. And little Ruth, the youngest at 6, had a voice so angelic it often stole the show during Sunday school performances. Together, they were a portrait of harmony, the kind of family that others envied, admired, and aspired to emulate. But perfection has a way of hiding its cracks. It sits there, gleaming in the light, fooling everyone who doesn't bother to look closer. And the Jackson family's cracks were no different. They were hidden behind polished smiles, practiced prayers, and a carefully maintained image that seemed unshakable. That morning, As the congregation sang in unison and Philip's powerful voice led the prayers, no one in that church could have imagined what was about to unfold. No one could have guessed that this family, this beacon of strength and faith, was standing on the edge of a cliff. And soon, one tiny moment would send them plummeting. It started with something so small, so mundane, that no one thought twice about it. A routine doctor's appointment for little Ruth. The kind of thing that fills a parent's day with barely a passing thought. But in that doctor's office, with a single sentence, the first crack appeared in the Jackson family's carefully crafted facade. A crack that would grow wider, splitting open secrets long buried and shattering lives in ways no one could have foreseen. Because perfection is often just an illusion. It all began on a quiet weekday afternoon, a trip so routine it didn't even register as significant. Ellen Jackson had taken her youngest, Ruth, to Grady Memorial Hospital for a standard checkup. Ruth sat on the examination table, her little legs swinging back and forth, humming softly to herself, a tune Ellen couldn't quite place but found comforting nonetheless. Dr. Amelia Carter, their trusted family physician, smiled warmly as she concluded the examination. It was nothing out of the ordinary, a reassuring report of a healthy, thriving child. But just as Ellen reached for her purse, ready to leave, Dr. Carter glanced at Ruth's file with a slight frown. "Mrs. Jackson," she said, her tone casual, "I see we don't have Ruth's blood type on record. Would you mind if we ran a quick test to update her file?" Ellen, without hesitation, nodded. It seemed so trivial, so harmless. A few minutes later, Ruth's cheerful chatter filled the room again, the moment already slipping from Ellen's mind as they headed home. Nights passed without another thought about that checkup. Then came the call. Dr. Carter's office had asked to schedule a follow-up appointment, not with Ruth, but with both Ellen and Philip. It seemed strange, but Ellen brushed it off, assuming it was a minor oversight or paperwork clarification. When they arrived at the doctor's office, Ellen couldn't shake a faint sense of unease. She sat next to Philip, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Philip, ever calm and composed, gave her a reassuring smile, though his curiosity was evident. Dr. Carter entered, her expression careful, too careful. She sat down across from them, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of Ruth's file. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "there's something we need to discuss." She hesitated, as though weighing how best to deliver the blow. Ruth's blood type is O-negative. Based on the genetic rules of inheritance, it's biologically impossible for her to be Philip's biological child. The words hung in the air, heavy and electric, like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm. Ellen's serene smile faltered, her face draining of color. Her breathing quickened, and her hands, once steady, began to tremble. Panic crept into her eyes, a storm of emotions she couldn't mask. Dr. Carter's voice, calm but unrelenting, seemed to echo in the small room. Ellen looked down at her hands, gripping the hem of her dress as though it could anchor her to reality. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Philip turned to Ellen, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. His brow furrowed as if trying to make sense of the impossible. Imagine, for a moment, being in his shoes. Imagine the ground beneath you giving way as the foundation of your life crumbles. How would you feel if the child you had loved, cherished, and raised as your own turned out not to be yours? Could you even comprehend such a betrayal? Let me ask you this. Would you want to know the truth? Or would you rather live in blissful ignorance, preserving the life you've built, even if it's a lie? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, share this video with someone who loves these kinds of moral dilemmas. Trust me, they'll thank you later. Or maybe not. That blood test, so ordinary and unremarkable, had planted the first seed of destruction. What came next would shake the Jackson family, and everyone around them, to their core. The drive home was suffocatingly silent. Ellen sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Philip gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw set in a rigid line. His mind raced, turning over the words that had been spoken in the doctor's office, each one cutting deeper than the last. When they arrived home, the silence followed them into the house, thick and heavy. The children were asleep upstairs, the sound of their soft breathing the only thing breaking the stillness. Philip waited until they were alone in the living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting shadows across their faces. His voice was low, trembling with restrained fury, as he broke the silence. "Tell me the truth, Ellen. Who is Ruth's father?" Ellen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She shook her head, as if denying it to herself, her lips trembling as tears began to well up in her eyes. "Don't lie to me," Philip demanded, his voice rising, his calm cracking under the weight of his anger. "Who is it?" Ellen's voice was barely a whisper, cracked and trembling. "It's Jeremiah. Pastor Jeremiah Simons." The room seemed to tilt. In that moment, Philip felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. The weight of betrayal crushed him, not just from Ellen but from Jeremiah, his mentor, his guide, the man who had shaped his faith and his career. He took a step back, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking as he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what Ellen had just admitted. "Jeremiah," he repeated, his voice low and strained, as if saying the name aloud would somehow make it less real. "The man who's been in this house? Around my children? Around me?" Ellen nodded, her tears now streaming freely down her face. "I'm sorry, Philip. I never meant for it to happen." "Never meant for it to happen?" Philip shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You didn't just destroy our marriage, Ellen. You destroyed everything." Ellen crumpled into a chair, her hands covering her face. Philip paced the room, his emotions boiling over. Then, suddenly, he stopped, turning to face her, his voice cold and sharp. "What about Joshua?" he asked, his tone chilling. "Is he mine?" Ellen froze, her hands dropping from her face. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. "Joshua, too?" Philip whispered, his voice breaking. He sank into the couch, his head in his hands, the weight of the betrayal too much to bear. "How could you?" Ellen reached out toward him, her voice pleading. "Philip, I was weak, and I made mistakes. But it doesn't change how much I love you. It doesn't change how much I love our family." Philip stood abruptly, stepping away from her. "Our family, that man. Jeremiah. He took everything from me. My wife, my children, my life. And you let him." Imagine being in Philip's shoes at this moment. Imagine discovering that someone you trusted, someone you respected, had betrayed you in the most profound way possible. What would you do? Would you confront them, seek revenge, or try to forgive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, trust me enough to hit that like button, okay? I promise it's less complicated than this story. The truth was out. The cracks in their family had become gaping chasms, and Philip's trust had been obliterated. But this was only the beginning. The next steps would lead to choices that no one could take back. In the weeks that followed the revelation, Philip Jackson was a shadow of the man he once was. The pastor who once filled Graceful Redemption Church with fire and conviction now delivered sermons that were lifeless, hollow. The words came out, but the meaning wasn't there. His congregation noticed the change, whispering among themselves, but no one dared to question him. At home, it was worse. Philip could barely look at his children. When he saw Joshua's confident stride or Ruth's innocent smile, all he could see was Jeremiah. Jeremiah's betrayal etched into their features, mocking him with every glance. He tried to act as though nothing was wrong, but his rage simmered beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. Each interaction with Ellen was cold and distant, their once loving bond now replaced by a chasm of anger and resentment. Day by day, that rage grew, consuming him. It was all he thought about: Jeremiah Simons, the man who had taken everything from him. His wife, his children, his trust, his life. The more he dwelled on it, the more he knew he couldn't let it go. Something had to be done. And so, one evening, Philip made a decision. He told Ellen he needed time to clear his head, but the truth was, he had no intention of calming down. He got into his car and drove, the streets blurring past him as he gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. When he pulled up to Jeremiah's house, his heart pounded in his chest. The lights were on, the faint sound of laughter drifting through the windows. Philip sat there for a moment, staring at the house, the warmth it exuded only fueling his rage further. Finally, he stepped out of the car and approached the door, each step heavier than the last. Jeremiah answered quickly, a warm smile on his face. "Philip," he said, his voice full of familiarity. "Come in. What brings you here tonight?" Philip's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He stepped inside without a word, the door closing softly behind him. Jeremiah led him to the study, oblivious to the storm brewing in Philip's mind. "What's on your mind, Philip?" Jeremiah asked, pouring himself a drink, his casual demeanor only stoking the fire within Philip. "I know," Philip said, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that stops you in your tracks. Jeremiah froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "You know." Philip stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. "I know about you and Ellen. I know about Joshua. I know about Ruth." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. Jeremiah set the glass down carefully, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Philip, I never meant." "Save it!" Philip roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You didn't just betray me. You destroyed my family. You stole everything from me." The room filled with anger, accusations flying like daggers. Jeremiah tried to defend himself, but his words only poured fuel on Philip's rage. And then, silence. The kind of silence that feels like it lasts forever. In that silence, Philip's eyes fell on the heavy candlestick sitting on the edge of the desk. Without thinking, without hesitation, his hand closed around it. The first strike came hard and fast, cutting off Jeremiah's words mid-sentence. Lydia, Jeremiah's wife, rushed into the room at the sound of the commotion. Her screams pierced the air as she tried to pull Philip away, but his fury was unstoppable. In the chaos, Lydia fell, her cries silenced moments later. When it was over, the room was still. Too still. Philip stood there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he stared at the blood-streaked candlestick in his grip. The enormity of what he had done began to sink in, but it was too late. The damage was done. He left the house in a daze, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Outside, the world seemed unnaturally quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. 2 lives lost, and a man left broken. Was Philip justified in his actions, or did he go too far? Was his rage understandable, or did he let it consume him beyond reason? What would you have done in his shoes? Let's discuss in the comments. And while you're here, trust me enough to hit that like button. It's a much safer way to vent your emotions, I promise. But the tragedy didn't end there. The aftermath of Philip's actions would reverberate through the community, leaving scars no one could erase. The next morning, the quiet neighborhood around Jeremiah's house woke to a scene they would never forget. The front door stood ajar, and the faint smell of iron hung in the air. It was a neighbor, walking their dog, who first noticed the unsettling stillness. When they peeked inside, their screams shattered the early morning calm. Police arrived quickly, their presence turning the street into a spectacle of flashing lights and hushed whispers. Inside the study, they found the bodies of Jeremiah and Lydia Simons, the evidence of violence stark and undeniable. The blood-streaked candlestick still lay on the floor, a chilling reminder of the rage that had unfolded just hours before. It didn't take long to trace the crime back to Philip Jackson. Witnesses had seen his car parked outside the house that night, and when police arrived at his home, they found him sitting alone in his study, his hands trembling and stained with blood. The once revered pastor now sat in a police cell, his head bowed, his face a picture of a man defeated by his own actions. The trial was swift, but its impact was anything but fleeting. The community that once adored Philip now filled the courtroom, their faces etched with a mix of disbelief, betrayal, and sorrow. They had followed his sermons, trusted his guidance, and seen him as a beacon of moral authority. Now, they watched as he faced the justice system, his every action laid bare for the world to see. The prosecution painted him as a man consumed by jealousy and rage, unable to control the darkness within. They recounted the gruesome details of that fateful night, each word landing like a blow to those who had once held him in such high regard. The defense, on the other hand, portrayed him as a victim of betrayal, of emotional torment, of circumstances that would push anyone to the brink. Was Philip a victim of his wife's and Jeremiah's actions? Or was he a man who let his darkest impulses take control? The jury was left to decide, but the community, too, wrestled with these questions. How do you reconcile the image of a man who once stood for everything good with the reality of what he had done? Let's be real. What would you have done in Philip's place? Was he pushed too far, or did he cross a line no one should ever cross? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's hear what you think about the man behind the pulpit and the choices that led to this tragedy. And seriously, folks, don't commit murder. It's bad for your social life, your reputation, and honestly, your YouTube recommendations. Trust me on this one. The fallout didn't end with Philip's sentencing. His actions left scars on the congregation, the families involved, and the community as a whole. But one question lingered above all else. Could this tragedy have been prevented, or was it inevitable? The answers may never come, but the story of Philip Jackson will remain a haunting reminder of how fragile the line between faith and fury truly is. This story isn't about clear heroes or villains. It's about choices. Choices made in moments of weakness, betrayal that festered in the dark, and the devastating cost of unchecked emotions. Philip Jackson wasn't just a man of God. He was a man, flawed and vulnerable. Ellen's betrayal, Jeremiah's deceit, and Philip's own rage all collided in a storm that left no one untouched. At its core, this is a story about trust. About how fragile it can be, how easily it can be shattered, and how difficult it is to rebuild. But it's also a story about accountability, about how the choices we make, no matter how justified they may feel in the moment, can ripple outward, leaving destruction in their wake. So let me ask you, what lessons can we take from Philip's tragic fall? Was he a victim of circumstances, or did he allow himself to be consumed by his anger? Could this have ended differently, or was this path inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you see it. And hey, if you enjoyed this tale of secrets, scandals, and consequences, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Seriously, it's free, and it keeps me from calling your best friend to ask if they know your secrets. And while you're at it, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to keep their own secrets. Well, secret. You know who they are. Don't make me name names. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep watching Vic's True Crime Stories. Because you never know where the next twist in the tale might take us.